Confusion over the status of the ceasefire between the US, Israel and Iran. Contradictions and mixed messaging have sparked questions and concern over the viability of the truce. The Iranians and mediator Pakistan have been clear. Lebanon is part of the agreement. The US and Israel disagree. US Vice President J.D. Vance gave his take.
I actually think, and there's a lot of bad faith negotiation and a lot of bad faith, propaganda going on. I think this comes from a legitimate misunderstanding. I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran, and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states. Now, that said, the Israelis, as I understand it, again, I'm supposed to get a fuller report when I get on the plane, have actually offered to be, frankly, to check themselves a little bit in Lebanon because they want to make sure that our negotiation is successful. That's not because that is part of the ceasefire. I think that's the Israelis trying to set us up for success.
Well, the Israeli military carried out intense strikes on what it said were Hezbollah targets in Beirut. Lebanon's health ministry says more than 180 people were killed and hundreds more wounded. Israel called it the largest attack on Hezbollah infrastructure since the war began. All right, well, let's break all of this down and try to make sense of what is happening. And for that, we have Natasha Hall, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House, which is an independent policy institute. We are joined from Natasha's in Washington, D.C. Natasha, great to have you along. So let's start with J.D. Vance's comments that we just heard there. What do you make of them, and what does it actually tell us about the state of the ceasefire?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Pablo. I think that this is just another step in a very, very confusing array of statements that have been made, not just now in the past few weeks during this course of the war, but also in the summer when, in the midst of negotiations with Iran, Israel and the United States again sort of went to war with Iran. Now, with regards to his statements on misunderstandings with regards to the ceasefire, there very well might have been misunderstandings and different plans with different points at play. But I think that that shows the utter confusion with regards to these negotiations. It also says something about where the vice president is coming from. At the end of the day, a ceasefire has to be agreed to by both parties. If one side doesn't agree to the points in the ceasefire, then a ceasefire doesn't stand. So I think that a lot of this is going to have to be factored into negotiations. I think Israel is going to have to tone down its strikes in Lebanon in order to see any kind of progress with the Iranians at this point. And what we've seen in Lebanon is truly devastating. I mean, we're talking about 100 airstrikes, around about central Beirut in the course of 10 minutes. So the footage is truly shocking. And, I think that at this point, that is going to be a major factor in the immediate negotiations and the success of the ceasefire in just the next, few hours, few days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those images from Beirut are pretty horrifying. But I want to contrast the messaging that's been coming out of Washington to the messaging that's been coming out of Tehran. So just a short while ago, Iran's foreign minister posted this on X. The Iran-US ceasefire terms are clear and explicit. The US must choose ceasefire or continued war via Israel. It cannot have both. The world sees the massacres in Lebanon. The ball is in the US court, and the world is watching whether it will act on its commitments. Now, Natasha, how viable is the ceasefire if there isn't even agreement over whether Lebanon is actually included or not?
Well, I think that's the big question. And there's other points that Arakchi and others have pointed out, including the main factor in all of these negotiations with Iran, which is the enrichment of uranium, which the Iranian officials have also pointed out they have a right to. And clearly the Trump administration does not feel that way, nor does the Israeli government. So these are pretty huge sticking points. And now, so I think that the issue right now is, can there be a ceasefire in the next 2 weeks so everyone lays down their weapons in order to hammer out these various points. And then hopefully we see an extension of that. But these are very fundamental points to each party. So, I have my doubts, but at the end of the day, the Iranians have shown that they can essentially shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And this is really central to, I think, a lot of these issues. President Trump has also said the strait is going to be wide open for shipping, whereas the Iranians have said there's going to be limited traffic through there and there will be tolls placed on the ships that do go through. So again, there's a lot of confusion. And if the guns can remain silent in the next few days, maybe some of those negotiations can move forward. But again, these are really fundamental issues for Iran and for the United States and Israel. We're talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we're talking about the enrichment of uranium in Iran. I mean, these are the points that we've been talking about, not just for the past few months, but for years now.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get on to the Strait of Hormuz, I want to stick with the situation, of course, in Lebanon. I mean, as we've mentioned already. And where does this ceasefire leave Israel?
Yeah, well, I think Israel honestly intended to just weaken its opponents. It basically has a strategy that many have talked about with regards to Gaza, which is to mow the lawn. So understanding that your enemies will remain in place, they will probably be emboldened by successive strikes over the years, but you will go back in every few months, every few years, and try to reduce their capabilities again. So I think from Israel's perspective, what they have shown is that they can drag the United States into a war, even when most of President Trump's advisors and most others would probably advise against it. And they've also been able to degrade Iran's capabilities. Now, I think the question is whether or not the United States wants to continually, every couple of years, every year, every few months, get involved in a major war in the Middle East. And I think that's a resounding no from the U.S. population if you look at polling right now. So, I mean, I think that I think Israel is in, maybe the position it wanted to be in. It was able to sort of oversell enough to President Trump to get this war that it wanted. And I think that it was able to degrade Iran's capabilities. Now, from the perspective of the United States and for the rest of the world, including the Gulf countries that have been deeply affected by this, I think it's a huge loss, because it essentially showed that Iran has the capability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz and put a stranglehold on the global economy. That is a lot of leverage. And furthermore, I think for Hezbollah, for example, it's been able to survive these many, many rounds of strikes.
Yeah, well, I mean, within Israel, there has been pretty widespread support for this war in Iran. But actually, there have been voices who've been coming out and saying, I'm going to play you now something from the Israeli opposition leader, Yair Lapid, who suggested earlier that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was actually sidelined in the ceasefire talks. So we'll take a listen and then we'll come back to you.
Benjamin Netanyahu stood before the state of Israel and will try to sell you the idea that the campaign in Iran was a success. That would be an utter lie. What happened here is a diplomatic disaster on a scale I do not recall. Israel had no influence whatsoever over the agreement signed by the United States and Iran, brokered by Pakistan. They will try to sell you the idea that they consulted with us, that there were late-night talks and secret meetings. Know this, those are hollow lies.
Natasha, is this a humiliation for Benjamin Netanyahu?
I certainly, I don't see it that way. I mean, this is an opposition politician at the end of the day, so I think I would take anything he says with a grain of salt. I think here, and you have seen dipping poll numbers from the Israeli population on support of this war, but as you mentioned, it's still widely supported. I think, from the perspective of Netanyahu, he would have accepted an entire range of different results here, either degrading the Iranian regime all the way to regime change. And I think any one of those, including a failed state in Iran or a civil war in Iran, all of those would have met his objectives. So, I don't see this as necessarily a humiliation for Netanyahu. What I do see this as is a sort of an existential threat to the U.S.-Israeli partnership. which Lapid did not talk about. Because here in the United States, there is a lot of reporting on the fact that Israel essentially dragged the United States into this war, and that won't do well, I think, for the midterms coming up, the midterm elections we have coming up, for those that do support Israel in a very full-throated kind of way.
Let's bring in the issue of the Strait of Hormuz. You've mentioned it a few times. It's impossible to avoid when we're speaking about this war. It's one of course, the core issues as well in this ceasefire. What has actually changed, though, there since this ceasefire was announced around 24 hours ago now?
Well, not a whole lot, and one wouldn't expect there to be a huge change at this point. I think, many companies are still going to be reticent to be the first ships to go through the Strait of Hormuz. We've seen about a dozen go through. That's still very restrictive compared to what it was pre-war. And we've also seen the Iranians say that they will allow some to go through, and as I mentioned, some to pay a toll. It's unclear what that toll would be, but they're taking cryptocurrency and talking about that in terms of tolls. That would, of course, embolden the Iranian regime further because it still shows that they have complete control over the Strait of Hormuz, which is definitely not where Gulf countries would want to be, and probably not where President Trump wants to be either. Will we see, a gradual increase in ships going through? Probably. But there's a lot that needs to be dealt with. The Iranians have mined the strait as well. So I don't see, companies really jumping back in very, very quickly. So I think that will be sort of a gradual increase, assuming that this ceasefire stays in place.
Now, the Trump administration says that the strait has to reopen, and if that doesn't happen, it's essentially a deal breaker. You mentioned before that, the Strait of Hormuz has given the Iranians leverage, but really how much do they actually have, and how much does the strait actually give them?
I mean, the Strait of Hormuz gives them an enormous amount of leverage. We're talking about a fifth of the world's energy reserves. We're talking, or energy exports, and we're also talking about a third of the things needed for fertilizers here. So if this is delayed any further, it's going to have a massive impact on the world economy. And we're not even talking about things like helium and other necessary elements for all of the things that we use. So, I think it's a huge piece of leverage, in fact, for Iran. We had never seen this before. This is unprecedented, and we've seen a lot of wars fought in this region. So I think the very fact that Iran was able to show that it could do this is a big fail, I think, for the U.S. administration. I think President Trump was told a story by Benjamin Netanyahu and maybe other supporters of this war that was unlikely to happen and that the Iranian regime would capitulate before that did happen. And that, in fact, obviously did not happen. Now, we've also seen these incredible threats from President Trump that he would destroy Iran's civilization, never to return again. Now, whether or not he actually moves forward on that or, moves forward on threats to destroy critical civilian infrastructure in Iran, I think remains to be seen. But I wouldn't take that off the table because clearly opening the Strait of Hormuz is the priority for the president.
Well, it's interesting because U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance says that Iran has no cards. Would you say that is just wishful thinking based on what you've been saying?
Well, it's hard to say that they have no cards. I think that the president, the administration, has continued to try to escalate its rhetoric, thinking that would somehow cow Iran into surrender or into negotiations. But that clearly hasn't happened. And you saw President Trump back away from those threats not too long ago. And I think that is for the reason that they didn't actually want to go through with those threats. And they recognized that it wasn't working with the Iranian regime, which at the end of the day is just trying to survive. So it will do anything to survive. It's not trying to win a massive war at this point. It is really just trying to use its leverage to deter any kind of attacks that could lead to regime change or the destruction, essentially, of the IRGC and other elements of the Iranian regime.
Now, Natasha, you mentioned negotiations there. I mean, as we're heading into these negotiations, which are supposed to begin in Islamabad on Friday, I mean, let's not forget, of course, that there's still confusion. I mean, confusion seems to be the word that we're using over what's happening at the moment, over how many points there are to this plan, whether it's 10 or 15, depending on which side you're talking to, of course. But do you think those talks in Islamabad, which are supposed to begin, as I said, on Friday, do you think that they will actually happen as planned?
I mean, that depends, I think, on the next few hours and the next few days and what I think, President Trump is willing to do. I think what the Israelis are willing to do to make peace within the next few days. If the Strait of Hormuz does not open right away, which, as I said, I think it will be a gradual increase, and if that's going to be enough for President Trump. And then on the other hand, if the Israelis agree to stop, essentially, in Lebanon, the attacks in Lebanon that we've seen in the past few days. So, a lot hinges on whether or not they continue with this violent escalation. And then, subsequent, of course, Iranian retaliatory attacks, or if we see peace in the next few days. I think if we see a gradual de-escalation, then those talks can, in fact, happen. Whether they'll be successful is another thing. But I do indeed think that they could potentially happen. But there is a lot of mistrust, especially from the Iranians at this point. If you wanted to have, a more pragmatic or rational actor on the other side, this was probably not the way to get there. It's very difficult, I think, for any Iranian official at this point, after the threats that have been made, to really accept, U.S. promises at this point.
Well, Natasha, that brings me actually to the question of J.D. Vance once again, who'll be leading the U.S. side. What does that choice of Vance say to you?
I think it says a lot, actually. So there's been a lot of New York Times reporting recently about how President Trump was sort of convinced to go into this war. And it does seem like many around him, including many in the MAGA, the Make America Great Again movement, have been very much against this war. And Vice President J.D. Vance has been mentioned numerous times as a vociferous opponent of going to war amongst many. So I think, maybe that this signals that they want a softer side on, a more pragmatic side on the U.S. negotiating team. So, I mean, it could say something very positive. The only issue here is that you have Iranian negotiators that have been doing this for decades. They know the details inside out. And it's not clear to me that Vice President Vance has that same understanding of the other side or of the details involved.
Well, let's actually talk about the Iranian side, because Reuters is claiming through Pakistani sources that the Iranian team will be made up of the Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, and the Iranian parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf. Tell us a little bit about them. Are they hardliners or more moderate within the Iranian regime?
So, I mean, I think if we take a step back, what essentially has happened here is that there's been a movement within the Iranian regime away from the more clerical establishment towards the IRGC. And that's problematic because they tend to be much more hardline. Now, from what I've heard about Ghalibaf, he is a hardline pragmatist. So essentially, if he's dealing with someone else that's hardline on the other side, he's going to be hardline himself. If he's dealing with someone that he thinks is pragmatic, then he will essentially be pragmatic. And so that's what we know of him. With Araghchi, I think we know quite a bit about him. He's been doing this for quite some time, very skilled diplomatically. And, could potentially move into negotiations in good faith. But again, there's so many fundamental points in these negotiations that neither side agree upon, nor have they ever. So it's going to be interesting to see if any progress can be made in the next couple of weeks.
One final question, and it's just, are you hopeful?
I mean, unfortunately, I think if we broaden out to the past 2.5 years, it's hard to be hopeful. I think what we see across the region is a region in turmoil. Even those countries that never thought would see war, like the oil-rich Gulf states, are now worried, about their future. They had opened themselves up as hubs for trade and transportation and tourism. And the effects and consequences of this will be long lasting. And I think from the US side, even if the United States didn't move forward with some of those threats, I think the very notion of a US president saying that it was going to destroy civilization, never to return, is really going to impact the way that the rest of the world looks at the United States for the foreseeable future.
Natasha, I think we're going to leave it there. Really great to get your analysis, your insights. Of course, we'll be keeping a very close eye on developments in the coming hours and days. Natasha Hall from the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. Thank you very much and take care. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right, well, what do you think? What did you make of all the conflicting messages around this ceasefire? Do you think it's a deal that's destined to last? Let us know in the comments, and if you like this video, please hit that like button, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. I'm Pablo Folilias. Thanks for watching. Take care.